The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to this short session of 30 minutes on managing stakeholders for better team outcome. Tim Baker's my name, and I'll be with you for the next 30 minutes. Basically, the content of this presentation is part of a new book that I've got coming out very soon called Winning Teams, and this is one or two chapters in the book, actually. So just want to make sure that I'm being heard. It looks like I'm coming across loud and clear. So let's get underway and look at this very interesting topic. And it's often an underrated topic, and teams often look at themselves and they get cloistered in amongst their own activities. And sometimes they forget, of course, that there are end users and stakeholders that they need to work with. In fact, the team relies on those stakeholders. So let's talk about that a little further. So I guess there's three things that I'd like to do in the presentation. I wanted to talk about the three position model because I think it's a very useful model when we look at the whole concept of stakeholder management. So let's have a look at that. I think at the end of this presentation, what I'm hoping that you might do is to concentrate on your top 5 stakeholders and to get a handle on who they are and how you might build even better working relationships up with those top 5 stakeholders, because I think that's critical to your success. And I'm going to share with you a unique model, part of my book, which is the SPUR model. And this is how you can evaluate stakeholders in terms of their level of importance and relevance to your team. And I think it's important, first of all, to identify who your stakeholders are and then to work out their level of importance and relevance to the team and to the success of your team. So they're the three things that we will cover in the short session we've got today. So anytime you've got questions or comments, by all means, go to the question box, which is on the right-hand side. There might be a little orange arrow there. If you open that up, there'll be a little tab that says questions, and then simply open that up and type in your question. I'll get to see it straight away, and of course I'll refer to it as soon as I see it. And that way we can keep this as interactive as possible. And what I will do at the end of this presentation is I'll send you, because you've taken time out of your busy schedule to be here, I'll send you a copy of the slides and I'll send you a copy of the recording after the presentation sometime this afternoon. It'll give you an opportunity, if you wish to review that or to send it on to other people that might be interested in this concept of stakeholder management. All right, so what I want to do now is share with you my team identity model. And the team identity model, which you can see in front of you there, covers 8 particular characteristics of high-performing teams. Now, the 8 characteristics are on the outer rim of the model, and I don't think any of those would necessarily surprise you. I'll just quickly run through them. You've got building trust, share leadership, be agile, create purpose, manage stakeholders, which is essentially what we're going to be covering today, improve systems, utilize diversity, and learn continuously. Now, they are the 8 models from my own experience and research that I'd identify to be the key attributes of a high-performing team. And then in this inner layer here, we have the 3 key features, if you like, of team identity. And I define team identity as the degree to which a team member can identify with being a member of the team. And in order to do that, you've got 3 key features there: buffering, bridging, and building. Now, I don't have time to go into those in detail, but I do go into those in detail in the book. But I guess I'm showing you the map because I want you to realize that I'm concentrating on one of those 8 characteristics today, which is managing stakeholders. Now, the good news for you is that when you look at your team and you're saying, how can we improve our performance? It's not as if you've got to down tools and go and work on 8 things, because practically that's not possible. But the good news for you is that if you concentrate on working on one of those attributes, they're all interrelated, it's likely to impact positively on other attributes. So, for example, if you build trust in your team, it's likely to help you become help you become more collaborative and help you to share the leadership. So by building on one of those attributes, you're likely to contribute to the development of the other characteristics. Now that's the good news. The bad news is, of course, if one of those characteristics are not really a highlight of your team, then it's highly likely that it's going to impact negatively on other attributes around the model. So whilst they're all interrelated, the good news is you only need to work on one or two and you'll get some tremendous leverage from that. So my suggestion to you is to work on this managing stakeholders for today, and I'll show you some things that you can do that are simple, that can make a huge difference in terms of your ability to manage those stakeholders more effectively. All right, so let's move on to the topic itself. Now, the first thing we need to do is to establish, well, what do we mean by stakeholders? The word is used very often. We hear it regularly. It's one of those words, throwaway words. It gets used quite a lot. So what are stakeholders? So according to the Association of Project Managers, stakeholder management is the systemic identification, analysis, planning, and implementation of actions to engage with stakeholders. So stakeholders are anyone that your team deals with in its day-to-day interactions, or maybe more than day-to-day, which have some bearing on the quality of the service or the product that you deliver. So stakeholders, you could relate to them once every year. So they might be a regulatory body representing the government, or it might be something such as a supplier of goods or services to your business that you would liaise with once a week. All of these people have a critically important input into the quality of the output of your team. So obviously it's an important topic because no team works in isolation without, working with these stakeholders. The challenge for you as a team leader is to get your team members to look outward occasionally and understand that these stakeholders are critically important to not only their individual success, but also the team's success. So that's why it's important to occasionally get your team together and to do a stakeholder analysis, to actually, identify who are your key stakeholders and what could you do to improve the working relationship with those stakeholders, particularly if those stakeholders are critical to your success. Now, you may have 100 stakeholders once you've done the analysis. Now, it's impossible to spend all your time, effort, and energy building excellent working relationships up with 100 stakeholders. That doesn't mean, of course, you should neglect them, but it's impossible to get them to the point where it's optimized. So my suggestion to you is to look at the top 5 stakeholders and do what Pareto talks about the 80-20 rule. I'd spend 80% of my time working on the 20% that makes the difference. In other words, what I'd be doing is looking at the stakeholders that are critically important and asking ourselves the very important question, what can we do to improve our connection and relationship with the stakeholders? It's quite complex because those stakeholders may well have other teams they're dealing with. They may well have other priorities. And so therefore, it's not just a simple case that they're there to serve you. And so it becomes a little bit more complex when we start to look into it a little further. Okay, sorry, am I still, can you still hear me? Can I just get people to go to the question box and type in the word clear if I'm coming across loud and clear, because my computer just went off there and I don't know whether I'm coming across loud and clear or not. Could I just get an indication? Just type the word in. Oh, thank you. Okay, it's just it's just my technology. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, okay, good. Righto, it just sort of went blank there for a while. Anyway, let's keep going while the going's good. Okay, now the key takeaway that I'd like you to consider in this particular session today is really, who are your top five stakeholders? Could you identify who they are? Now, it's one thing for you as a team leader to be able to identify who they are, but it's another thing for your team to be able to agree on who they are. So what I suggest is that you do this as a collaborative exercise. In other words, you sit down with your team and you do some brainstorming about all the stakeholders that you have. Now, if you're working in an organization, you're going to have internal stakeholders and external stakeholders. So who are they? You just brainstorm all of them. You could even do yourself a mind map on a large whiteboard, I'd strongly recommend. And you just branch out and consider all the stakeholders that you are in touch with, and just keep going until you've exhausted the list. That's step one. Then I think step two is then you go through each stakeholder and determine its level, that stakeholder's level of importance in terms of the team's success. Now, I'll give you a process to do that shortly. But by doing that, what you're doing is you're identifying who these key stakeholders are, one, and two, you're getting agreement about this from your team. Because obviously, if you think a stakeholder is very important, but your team members don't appreciate their level of importance, that's a problem, or vice versa. So you've all got to be on the same page in relation to your identification of key stakeholders. So just doing that exercise, which takes 10 to 15 minutes in a team meeting, can be very, very useful. So stakeholders, of course, could be people or organisations or even teams. So you've got to identify, well, so for example, if it's a team, who is the key contact in that team? If it's an organisation, same thing, who is the key contact in that team? And you've got to work out who that is. So this is a very useful exercise. Now, we might consider this, let's consider this three position model. Now, when you look at people and when you see people communicating with each other, there's essentially three positions that people can adopt. Down here, you have first position. First position is the most basic position, and first position simply means that you're looking at things through your own eyes. So, for example, if you see two people arguing, finger pointing, raised voices, you can deduce that they're in first position. In other words, what they're both doing is they're trying to convince the other person that they're right. And of course, the other person's trying to convince the other person that they're right. Now, obviously, that's not a very good position to be in terms of being able to resolve a conflict or resolve anything really, because both parties are trying to defend their position. So let me use the analogy of being in a forest. So if we're in a forest and we've got our head buried up against a tree, the trunk of a tree, we may not understand or appreciate that we're in a forest because we're only looking at things through our own eyes, and all we've got in front of us is our own position, in this case, of course, a large tree. So this isn't a good position to be in, and often when you're working with stakeholders, this is precisely what happens. In other words, your team has a view and the stakeholder has a view, and both of you are trying to argue that your view is more important. Well, obviously, that's not a very good position to be in. Second position is a superior position, but it's not the perfect position. But second position is where not only do you have a point of view and the stakeholder has a point of view, but also that you understand the other person's point of view. So second position is almost putting yourself in the shoes of the other person or stakeholder so that you can understand where they're coming from. And so it's kind of like a form of empathy. And if you go and use the forest analogy again, it's these going from first position to second position would be to take a step back from the tree and to understand that that's one of many trees in the forest, and to realize, of course, that you are well and truly in a forest. So second position doesn't mean you're forfeiting your position. It simply means that I understand the other person's point of view. And what that means is that you've got to take the time and energy to understand where the stakeholder's coming from. And that requires you asking questions and so forth. Now, if we get to second position, we're in a much better position. But the ultimate position is third position. And third position is where not only do you have a point of view, first position, and second position is not only do I understand the other perspective where there is a potential conflict, but third position is that I can see their position and our position in the context of the current situation. In other words, I can contextualize the differences of viewpoint. I can, it's almost like a helicopter view. So if you go back to the forest analogy again, third position would be like getting into a helicopter and flying above the forest and looking down and noticing that there is a sea of green. You can't actually see the trees themselves because you're so far in the air, but you can see a big landscape of forest. So third position is the best position to be in. And by getting your team together and talking about stakeholders and working on how you're going to manage them more effectively is actually putting your team into third position, which I think is the critically important position to be in. So I'd strongly recommend that, if you see people in first position or yourself indeed, you try to get yourself into second position so you can understand the other person's point of view more effectively. And then, of course, third position is that you take a step back and understand the context of what they're saying and so forth and so on. So people who are very politically savvy, for example, are often able to put themselves into third position and step back from the conflict to understand the big picture of what's going on. So that's just a little skill that I think you need to think about, because I think it's very, very important not to stay in first position. It's not going to serve you well, and the stakeholders certainly not. What happens is if you stay in first position for too long, what happens is it entrenches your point of view and it entrenches the other person or stakeholder's point of view to a point where no point can you find a middle ground. So if you look at politics at the moment, and I'm thinking about the United States or in any place in the world at the moment, it's a strongly polarized political environment. There is very little attempt for either side, for example, left or right, to try to understand the other side's point of view, which of course would be useful, because then once you can understand it, of course, you can then contextualize it. But of course, that's not happening, as we know. All right, now the SPUR model, just to finish up. I think SPUR model is a great way of being able to then, so once you've sat down with your team and you've done a brainstorming exercise, you put all your stakeholders on a whiteboard, and there may be more than you think, and it's an interesting exercise, because the longer you do this, the more people will brainstorm other entities that might be considered to be a stakeholder. Now, what you need to do then is to make a reasonably objective judgment about the level of influence each stakeholder has in relation to your team. And I use SPIR. S is stake, P is power, I is importance, and R is regularity. So let's just quickly go over those so you understand that. And what you do is you rate your stakeholders on a scale of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 5 is high, 1 is low. So what I'm looking at is rating each stakeholder on a scale of 1 to 5 using these parameters to rate them. And whatever stakeholders end up with the highest result, you could argue we've identified these stakeholders as the most influential in terms of our team success. So stake is the stakeholder's financial or reputational stake in the team. So if your team is successful, right, will a stakeholder benefit from that? And if your team is not successful, will your stakeholders, will that be detrimental to a stakeholder? So it could be reputational or it could be financial. So one of the things is how much stake does that stakeholder have in your team's success, might be a better way of putting it. So you rate your stakeholders 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then you move on to the next one, which is power. This is the influence of the stakeholders over the success or failure of your team to achieve its purpose. So if this stakeholder decided all of a sudden not to cooperate with you, if this stakeholder all of a sudden decided to go against the grain and go against what your team was after, would that be problematic? So 5 is high, 1 is low again. So how much power or influence does that stakeholder have over your success as a team? Now, obviously that will vary and you have to make a judgment call on that. And of course, you rate each of your stakeholders on a scale of 1 to 5 around power. So the third level of analysis is the importance, the team's relevance on the stakeholder for resources. So this is how reliant your team is on the stakeholders themselves. So it might be that they're very important suppliers of product or service. And if they stopped supplying your team with products or service, you may find yourself in a hole. So obviously they would be rated a 4 or a 5. Now, that can happen. Now, let me give an example. If someone's supplying your team with services or product, and it's a highly competitive field, in other words, if you're not happy with the service or the product that that team is supplying your team with, and it's easy for you to transition to another supplier or product, supplier of product or service that provides exactly the same thing, then perhaps their rating wouldn't be as high. But if that's going to require a bit of pain and angst to do that, or it's a geographical issue or whatever it might be, then it's probably likely it's going to be rated a higher score. And the final thing is that you might look at the regularity, and that is the regularity of contact you have with the stakeholder. Because the more contact you have with the stakeholder, the more potential there is for misunderstanding. So if you've got a weekly contact or even a daily contact with a stakeholder, then it's likely that, of course, it's, apart from anything else, you're probably relying on them quite a bit. But of course, if things go wrong, it can be quite a problem. But of course, some stakeholders you'd only deal with once a year, right? So that would be rated lower than it would be if you're dealing with them day to day or weekly. So you rate each stakeholder on a scale of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 on stake, on power, on importance, and on regularity. And then, of course, what you do is you add up your scores and you'll find out very quickly who your top 5 stakeholders are. And once you've identified your top 5 stakeholders, the conversation with your team then is around what we can do to strengthen our association or connection with these top 5 stakeholders. And you brainstorm this with the team so that the team are engaged in the process and it's not just left to you. Because the bottom line is, as a team leader, you're not the only one that really is responsible for stakeholder management. You're trying to create a very clear perception in your team that it's everyone in the team that is responsible for stakeholder management. Your job ultimately is to make sure that it's well managed overall, but at the end of the day, some of your team members have good working relationships with some stakeholders, and some of your team members may have no relationship with the stakeholders. So there's people in your team that are in a very good position to be able to influence the stakeholder management process. All right, so really that exercise is very powerful. From my experience, it takes about 20 minutes, but it's a very powerful exercise, and you'll find that it's very, very useful once you've identified your top 5 stakeholders. All right, so just to finish up, just a quick plug. If there's any questions that you've got, please ask them now because we're just about done. But I just wanted to offer you something for the time that you have spent with me today. My new book is coming out at some point, and with COVID, of course, it's been delayed, but it should be out very soon. And I'm offering you this, which I think is a great offer, but it's up to you, I guess, whether you think it's a great offer. I'm going to offer you a copy of my book pre-ordered for $30 plus postage. So if you pre-order and pay for the book before it arrives, then I will give you access to a free online course on building high-performing teams, which I would value and I would sell for $675. So you can have access to that. So in other words, you can start working on some of these things that we've been talking about before the book arrives. So when the book comes, you can confirm certain bits and pieces around the book. So there's an opportunity for you. All you've got to do is send me an email by the close of business today. And in that email, just say, yes, I'd like a copy. And of course, I'll send you an invoice. And when the book comes out, I'll sign it for you and send it out to you. So there's the offer. So you're more than welcome to take advantage of that offer for being here today online. So there doesn't look like there's any questions, folks. Sorry about that little stutter halfway through, but it was quite scary. The whole screen went black. And I thought, oh, there's a power failure or something's gone wrong, but obviously it didn't have any impact. So I'll send you a copy of the slides. I'll send you a copy of the recording this afternoon on an email, so keep your eyes peeled for that. I'll remind you about the offer here that I've got for you. And if you're interested in other of these webinars on my book, then they're coming up on a regular basis. So just stay tuned to my newsletter, and you can go into those free of charge, of course. So thanks, everyone. Hopefully that's been useful for you. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I hope that you found something useful. And don't forget to get your team together. Yeah, thanks, Chris, for thank you for that nice comment. Appreciate it. All right, all the best, everyone. Have a great weekend, and we'll catch up next time we meet. Thank you and goodbye.